Hello, good morning, everyone. Well, it's a real pleasure to finally participate to this SAfA Congress and share with you some elements of our ongoing research. And first of all, me and Luc would like to thank really warmly Alex Haven and Frederica Jess for their constant effort in maintaining this session on entanglements in Africa, despite the difficult sanitary context we all have experienced since 2020. And to question this notion of entanglement in Africa and the different forms this concept can adopt in archaeology, we thought it could be interesting to dedicate this paper to pottery, which represent quite abundant and widespread material among first and second millennia archaeological context, but which potential might have been somehow underestimated, for example, in establishing regional or macro-regional periodization. So to this end, we will progressively put in parallel comparable elements of different archaeological sequences from Western Africa, which individually represent a certain level of abstraction, and demonstrate that an unsuspected canvas of relations can already be identified through this process. So to do so, we will start in Senegal and the Gambia, where a unique megalithic phenomenon gathering nearly 20,000 funerary monuments developed between the 8th to 15th century AD. In this region, first methodical archaeological research initiated by Guy Tillmans during the 70s revealed a rich material culture and notably large corpuses of pottery remains, often displayed in front of monumental architectures. Among those, Guy Tillmans highlighted the recurrence of carinated pot, here represented on the right, a quite uncommon ceramic morphology, which was, in a way, seen as emblematic of the Senegambian megalithic pottery tradition since the publication of Tillmans' excavation in 1980s. And this originality can also be perceived at a macro-regional scale if we now take into account the main ceramic periodization available for the Senegal Valley River and for southern Mauritania, for example, here both corresponding to settlement sites. In the later, in Tegdaoust and Kumbi Saleh, pottery refers to really different types of production as in Senegambia. And similar observation can be made for sites such as Sinthiou-Bara, Thiobalel of Siré in eastern Senegal, where pottery remains abundantly show closed-mouth jars, and from the 11th century, the emergence of channeled decorated pottery. But the diversity of the Senegambian megalithic pottery cannot, of course, be summarized only through one of its components. A recent doctoral research integrating all pottery remains discovered on the Wanar necropolis and more generally in the Senegambian area contributed to define a new periodization for this region. Thanks to carefully documented stratigraphic context in Wanar, this sequence highlights 4 phases, starting at the end of the first millennium AD and ending in the early 16th century. In its first stage, the sequence is dominated by white paste pottery production, notably large cylindrical jars decorated with impressed twine or fish vertebrae roulettes and red slip. This white paste production continues during the phase 3, around between the 11th and 12th century, with red slip globular jars. The appearance of new black paste jars with folded strip roulette decoration and large carinated pottery seems to indicate, at least in Wanar, the presence of a new potting community. From phase 2, between 13th and 14th century, a new pottery production made of small carinated bowls also seems to refer to a new potting community and matches with the emergence of a new architectural style in Wanar. Phase 1 pottery, representing the last stage of Senegambian megalithism, shows an increase of lead-covered recipients decorated of red slip. Accepting the Senegal Valley River and southern Mauritania, the main core of data regarding ceramic sequences comes from the inland Niger Delta in Mali, which has been an important focus for West African archaeological investigation for many decades. Djenné is probably one of the major excavated sites of this region, partly because of the important chronostratigraphic sequence recorded there, which spans from the previous era's last centuries to the early 15th century AD. Unlike sequences from eastern Senegal or southern Mauritania, one can easily notice various points of convergence, at least if we consider firstly morphological criteria. The production of small bowls and jars progressively evolves to carinated plates and lead-covered pottery, and later to carinated bowls. More generally, if we consider that intrasite pottery sequences represent a first level of abstraction, allowing the construction of wider models that would thus include different sites, what the comparison of the Senegambian periodization with other peculiar site sequence would tell us. So let's take it step by step and consider about the different morphological categories we observed in the Senegambian context. Starting with the carinated bowls we identified there from the 11th to the 16th century during phases 3 and 2, and let's compare them with other archaeological data from Western Africa. Even in first approach and considering that additional site could be added, it is striking to notice that carinated bowls globally fits into a common frame of time. If a few carinated elements contemporary to the Senegambian examples are figured in eastern Senegal, some others are present among various Malian corpuses like Djenné, Togéré Dupil, and Galia. In Dangandulun, a ritual rock shelter in Prédogon country, the really small carinated bowls discovered could date back to the mid-7th century AD. A similar observation can be made regarding the distribution of jars with a cylindrical body, and for which example can be found during the second half of the first millennium AD. On anthropic mounds like Djenné or the Togéré Dupil and Galia, like some Senegambian examples found in an upside-down position in the center of funerary monuments, this cylindrical jar from the inland Niger Delta often refers to funerary context. In Dangandulun, the use of this pottery could have extended to the late 11th century. However, a slightly different pattern pops up if we consider the globular and rounded belly jars identified in Senegambia. Their distributions appears to be relatively widespread in times among West African contexts from the beginning of the first millennium AD to the mid-16th century. However, this situation is not really surprising, as this type of jars are really common in West African pottery assemblage, even in modern and contemporary context, as ethnographic data can attest. This wide distribution in time and space is also a characteristic of lead-covered recipients. In the Senegambian megalithic area, they are represented since the early phases of the periodization, but are really dominant between the 15th and 16th centuries. In Senegal, this kind of pottery was mainly associated to shell middens of the Atlantic Saloum Delta, but the presence of an internal support in the upper part of the pottery is designed to receive and support the lead coming from above. This technical solution has been observed in Djenné, but an alternative option was preferred there. The lead directly rests on the upper part of an angulated pottery. Of course, in both of these cases, the leads are designed to fit with the pottery on which they will adapt on. If some of these ceramics were found in domestic context, like Tiebala, Kawinza, Moissam, or Dia, others refers to ritual context, like in Dangandulun, or even funerary contexts, like in phase 3 Geno-Geno or the Togere, Dupuil and Gallia. In Geno-Geno, the small size of some of these spots seems to be linked with immature funerary deposits. However, our research on Senegambian pottery production revealed another possible type of lead, the carinated balls themselves, or more precisely, we could say some carinated balls. This original functional determination emerged by a simple distinction between highly carinated recipient on the one hand and slightly carinated balls on the other hand. Precise morphometric attributes and measurements permit to determine these two categories. In 1R, this morphometric distinctions perfectly fits with the presence of certain types of jars and jar rims, here represented on the left, designed to receive a highly carinated pottery on its top in an upside-down position. While these jars are highly carinated pottery belong to the same stratigraphic level in phase 3 between the 10th and 12th century AD, the transition to phase 2 between the 12th and 14th century marks a radical shift. Only slightly carinated small balls, incompatible with a lead function, are present during phase 2. They are also manufactured with a different warping out technique and show different decorative patterns and techniques procedures. These small carinated balls, illustrated on the right, also belong to a peculiar context. In fact, they were successively and deliberately deposited in front of stone circle architecture, then adopting a commemorative function. The concept of funerary urns is a well-documented phenomenon in West Africa, identified in the Malian inland Niger Delta, in Burkina Faso, and to the northern fringe of Nigeria in the Lake Chad Basin. Referring to secondary burials or cremation containers, their large geographic distribution in West Africa also meets a large chronological frame, which covers the last 2 millennia. However, scientific literature revealed that a few cases involve the use of a lead-like carinated pottery on the top of jars. The main examples in this sense are provided by Macintosh excavation in Geno-Geno, where carinated pottery are displayed on the top of rounded globular jars between the mid-9th and the late 14th century, or also at the same period in the neighboring site of Togere, Dupuil, and Gallia. Despite the important timescale of Geno-Geno's phase 4, this chronological attribution matches with example deposited on Senegambian megalithic sites between the 11th and 12th century, but for which, unfortunately, no human remains are associated, thus interrogating the possible funerary function of the later containers. In Geno-Geno, the most ancient carinated pot used as a lead is slightly different as those described before, as it presents a cylindrical body. However, like in the Senegambian megalithism, the outer parts of carinated pottery and jars are largely decorated with roulette impressed motif. A quite opposite situation appears if we finally try to compare the little commemorative beakers and slightly carinated bowls from the Senegambian area with other archaeological funerary contexts in Western Africa. In fact, only one or few carinated bowls incompatible with a lead function has been recorded in a funerary context from Geno-Geno. Nevertheless, the ritual practice of pottery deposit is often attested in ethnography among many modern and contemporary Western African populations, whether it is linked to funerary structure or commemorative spaces. This progressive comparison of peculiar types of production from one periodization to another thus allow to recognize which pertinent criteria of analysis is meaningful for our purpose. In this first approach, we can already notice certain similarities between the pottery production identified in the Senegambian funerary context and other contemporary West African context, mainly funerary. Despite some typological differences regarding, for example, decoration techniques, these parallels are particularly striking in the case of cylindrical jar in the early phase of the sequence, and laterly, if we consider this highly carinated pottery used as lids on the top of jars. The recurrence of this category of pottery in funerary context in these two regions thus interrogates the spread of common conception of funerary practices in medieval West Africa, for example, through the Senegal and Niger rivers. As concluding words, we could say that the level of analysis classically adopted in West African pottery studies contributes to differentiate long chronological sequences, such as in Niger Delta, Senegal River Valley, or Mauritania, but quite often independent from each other. A morphometric approach of so-called carinated pottery among Senegambian megalithic material culture allow to identify two distinct types of recipient. This dichotomy corresponds here to functional differences and seems to echo mutation in ritual and commemorative practices. Ethnographic sources illustrate that elements of these practices might have survived until recent times. First of all, at a regional scale, ritual transformation observed through pottery production from Senegalese and Gambian megalithic sites offer precious insight into ancient beliefs and religions. These mutations also correspond to the appearance of a new ceramic tradition. However, this dynamic cannot be extended to the entire material culture so far, neither be translated in terms of movement of population. At a macro-regional scale, some pottery production from Senegal and Mali already show convergent patterns participating to the construction of periodization for ceramic material culture in West Africa during the last 2 millennia, an attempt that would, of course, have to be further consolidated in the next times. Thanks a lot for your attention, and waiting for your question and remarks during the research session next week. Thanks a lot.